Hi, thank you for being here and listen to me. I'm going to talk about the social cerebellum, and you will probably wonder why I'm talking about the social cerebellum. I will illustrate this with this nice picture of the Brussels main square, which is a medieval city. On the right, you see also a number of cliches like manneke pis, Belgian fries, Belgian beers, and so on. And I will argue that the cerebellum actually is doing more or less the same, is assembling cliches about how things should work and will work, so to automatize things, actions executed by humans. Why is the cerebellum so important, you might wonder? Well, if you look at the number of neurons in the cerebral cortex, it's 16 billion neurons. But if you look at the number of neurons in the cerebellum, it's 4 times more. There's a lot of calculation going on that we often ignore when we scan humans. And as another example, the cerebellum is an important risk factor for autism. If you have injuries at birth, your chances of acquiring autism are increased, and it's a second risk factor for it. So, is the cerebellum indeed social? And what kinds of social functions does it support? And I'm going to focus this task only on mind reading or mentalizing. So it's about reading the mind, the intentions, the beliefs, the traits of other people. And to illustrate this, I go back to the 7 network structure of the cortex that you all know, and I assume, and the same structure is also represented in the cerebellum. For example, there's a primary representation, a secondary representation, and even a third one. And we are going to concentrate us on the default or mentalizing network at the posterior cerebellum. And in one of our first studies, we found that we conducted a meta-analysis, and we found out that the studies that showed what we call here event mentalizing or abstract mentalizing indeed showed activation mainly in the posterior part of the cerebellum, and the overlap was impressive with the Buckner 7 network structure, and especially the default network. So that encouraged us to explore this similarity further, and also the function, the role of the cerebellum, the specific role of the cerebellum. And the idea is the following. Since the cerebellum is helping out movement, automatizing movement, by automatizing this, making it more smooth, fluent, and spontaneous, probably for social behavior, the cerebellum is doing the same, but without overt movements, just in perceiving movements of others or in understanding your own movements. So one of the major important characteristics here is the sequence of a behavior. It could be the rhythm, it could be whatever, but what you need to have at least is to have the sequence right to understand the behavior. So the cerebellum tries to predict what you have to do, because it takes too long to wait until to infer what you should do under some circumstances. So the brain builds forward models that tell you what to do immediately. And the cerebellum will also develop these models with predictions about what will happen in your sensory environment, what will be the responses of the environment, and also responses of your own body, how you will feel about this, so that you can quickly engage in actions. So we will test this idea of sequencing in social understanding, and especially mentalizing. And we compared the behavior of 11 patients with degenerative cerebellar lesions. That means there were global lesions in the cerebellum, and we compared it with healthy controls. And one of the tasks was sequencing. And I'll show you some examples. So people are given pictures in which the events are put in a random order, and they have to put these orders in the correct order. I'll show you an example of a mechanical physical example, and you see immediately what it means, like this. So that's quite simple to perform, right? Then we also have social scripts, a little bit social, but very well rehearsed routines, like going to a shop, picking items from the shelf, paying, saying goodbye, and then leaving. Then we have other ones. Try to figure out this sequence for yourself. If you have found it, raise your hands. In the interest of time, I will give the solution. But it usually takes much more time. This is the one. So the boy looks at his box and sees a lot of one chocolate left. Then he goes playing, and a girl discovers the box, eats the sweets, the chocolates, and upon return, the boy finds his box empty. This is a clear example of what we know as a false belief task. You need to understand that what a boy knows and believes is different from what you see and believe. And it takes up to 4 years old before children are able to solve these tasks. That's why it took so long for you, because it's still a difficult task to do. So this is a key task in social mentalizing. And we embed this kind of false belief task in a sequencing task as well, to see whether the cerebellum is involved here. What we saw was that across the different conditions, the mechanical ones, the social scripts, the patients were doing quite well, but they were severely impaired for the false belief sequencing task. We took the same task, we developed a true belief version of it, just the same elements of the story, but then a true belief, no distinction between own and other belief. And we scanned participants, now this time young healthy participants. And we also developed new story sequencing tasks which just had the same structure, logic behind them. What we found was in the picture sequencing task, the posterior cerebellum was activated, as you can see here, both for false belief and true belief tasks, right? And also for the story, the verbal version. Again, the posterior cerebellum here and the right and left parts. Now we were wondering, is this also true that the order of social events is important even if it's not inherently required, like in a false belief task? There you need to have the order right to understand it. But if we simply have a random unrelated order and we ask participants to learn this, as compared to simply reading material, so as an example here, 6 events that imply the same trait of this person, Lixia. Can you see this? Yeah, you can see this. So 6 events, and they had to learn the order of these events. And they were given 20 seconds or 40 seconds, but minutes, but seconds. And that didn't differ too much. And as you can see here, these are the first results of the first 19 participants. Again, the posterior cerebellum was involved when we compared learning the order as opposed to simply reading these sentences. There was no activation for control conditions in which participants had to learn the order of events involving non-social objects and non-social features. Then this activity disappeared. So, if I summarize so far, the results show that among patients, cerebellar patients, there's impairment in false belief tasks. This effect has been replicated now in this very city, in Rome, with the same material on Italian participants. And under the scanner, you see at least the right posterior cerebellum, and quite often also the left cerebellum is activated when people have to generate the order or to remember the order of the events. What about connectivity? Because one of the requirements for the cerebellum to be of any use is to communicate with the cortex and to tell the cortex, yes, this is the right order, do as usual, or something is wrong here and you have to change and watch out. So we studied the connectivity between the social cortex and the social cerebellum. And we took the last picture sequencing task, and we had 5 regions of interest that I will show you here. And as you can see on the right and left, posterior cerebellum, which is in the mentalizing area indicated in white. And then, of course, the TPJ and the medial prefrontal cortex. And we found closed loops. Closed loops are required between the cortex and the cerebellum, contralateral as we would expect, but also for the other one, but also ipsilateral, which is somewhat more unusual, but can be correct and is correct according to these data, and then further connectivity within the mentalizing brain. What is interesting is that all the information coming from the cortex to the cerebellum, these were positive connectivities. The reverse direction from the cerebellum to the cortex were negative. We interpret this as a negative error signal, signaling the cortex something is wrong here. Probably. We are not sure yet. So far, I've shown you tasks in which participants are required to come up with an order or learn orders explicitly. But what about implicit sequencing? Is it not something autistic, but patients have a lot of trouble with learning implicitly how social rules go and how they should behave and so on? So we try to develop an implicit sequencing task, a false belief task as well, based on the serial reaction time tasks that exist in the literature. And so the task we devised is, that I will show you now, is you have to locate the flower as seen by one of two Smurfs when they are looking at the screen. So in this case. But sometimes they look at you and then they cannot see how many flowers were given to them, right? So now I'll try to go through that task with you. It's not that easy, so be prepared. Oh yes, before I go on, I tell you a few features that are important. We use two Smurfs to make sure that people develop distinct agents-belief associations. So they need to associate the correct belief with the correct agent, so to underlie really belief attributions. Second, within the presentation, there is a fixed order that they don't know about of who gave that flower, at which location it was given, and also the order in false and true beliefs. Or let's say false and true trials. And finally, we ask them to indicate the number of flowers so there is no motor involvement in the response. So it's uncorrelated with the motor response. And here now we will try together. 1, still 1, 2, still 2, she's not looking. 1, still 1, because that was in the previous trial. So that's the kind of how the task is organized. You were all with me, you could solve this, I hope. What we found was on the true trials, the location where the flower was given at the first, second, third, or fourth location was memorized implicitly. I'm not going into the details how we do this. And secondly, on the false trials, when they look at you, then the order of the false and true beliefs is learned implicitly. So they don't know anything about this, but they seem to learn this implicitly without really explicitly knowing that they learned this. And we will do this under the scanner after the summer. So I can't show you any posterior cerebellum. Sorry for that. Now, we were also wondering to what extent are these areas that I've shown you before in our research really related to social mentalizing, or is there also some semantic functioning going on or other functions? We don't know, because there are several meta-analyses that show that there are other things might be going on, but to make sure, narratives, we consider this a social thing because narratives go about people who do things and have intentions and so on and so on. So we took 3 regions of interest from our sequencing tasks on the left here, and on the right, 2 regions of interest from the Neurosynth database. And then we looked up all the studies that presented activations, and then we subdivided them in several categories, like facial body expressions, human actions, like false belief stories, true belief stories, self-decisions, autobiographic past or future, simply humans in a story but not really sure what they are doing, trait adjectives, trait inferences, other mentalizing tasks, emotional recognition. We were not sure whether this is considered social mentalizing or not, but we left it in. And then you have all the rest, which is indicated in white. And the first region of interest shows that more than 80% of these studies involved social mentalizing. And especially the number of human actions was quite large. So the white are other motor or other functions. The same is true for the other regions of interest. The largest category again being human actions. And the one region of interest that was somewhat closer to the border of the executive control network, number 5, which is somewhat closer to the other network in gray, I don't know, yeah, maybe you can see this. There, the number of social mentalizing studies drastically dropped to about 40%. So clearly it seems to indicate that these areas are really specialized for mentalizing and nothing else. Of course, what is surprising is that none of these tasks really manipulated sequences explicitly. So, but of course in human action and especially in false beliefs, we know that sequencing is important. So this probably explains why the social cerebellum is activated, but there is still a lot of work to do to manipulate order in these tasks to make sure that that is indeed the element that activated the cerebellum. So, and I thank you for your attention. I also thank all the people involved in this research. Thank you.